Welcome to Buckets. My name's Matt Moore. I'm the senior NBA writer for the Action Network. I'm joined by Joe Delara and Andrew O'Connor Watts, who, if you're joining us at youtube.com/The Action Network, which is a great place to find all sorts of great content, you'll see them both wearing Knicks hats, like the dorks they are, because half of our company, like 90% of our company, are Knicks fans. As they celebrate an incredible win for the city of New York. It's not every day that you get to absolutely play like garbage and get outplayed in every facet of the game and the officials just hand it to you. But that is absolutely what happened in Game 5 of the WNBA series. I'm livid over there. I have Liberty tickets and I'm mad. But that's not what we're doing today. Today, we have a very special episode for you because it's the last day of preseason content here on Buckets. We've done most improved player and sixth man and Brandon Anderson's 9 million bets. I've done win totals on every single team. We've broken it all down. We've done the whole thing, and now we are here. And what today we're going to do is we are going to give you how to bet the NBA regular season. Starting tomorrow, you will have best bets in your inbox of podcasts. Wherever you get your podcast, you're going to find our best bets episode tomorrow for you to go ahead and get in on Celtics, Knicks, and Lakers T-Wolves. I already have some plays in the Action Network app, which you can track alongside the million other futures we all have. This is probably, Joe, this is like our the group as a whole. We have a lot of plays this time. For whatever reason, there's just like everybody's got a million positions right now going into the season.
Yeah, it's been really active. I think in part, like, I think the Olympics kind of got everything like going. Like, there was basketball on the forefront of everybody's mind, and then that led obviously into the WNBA playoffs. So I feel like everybody was really excited for this season because the basketball that we've been watching has been, for the most part, outside of a little bit of a ref show, has been really, really good.
Yeah, I've wanted to get Watts on to give more best bets because he has more, but he keeps having, every time I'm like, hey, I'd love to have you on, buddy. He's like, oh, sorry. My hairdresser is having a bar mitzvah. I'm sorry. I can't. So I've been unable to get him on. So I'm glad to have him on board. And especially it's good because Watts has a model that he uses for NBA betting. I hesitate to use the word model. I think projection system is probably a better word for it. But that's like what I use to determine these things. So we'll kind of get into the nuts and bolts of how to bet these things. So I want to start here. And Joe, I'll start with you because I know that you're a props better, but I also want to know how much you look at spreads and totals. The board comes out the night before, and usually we get spreads around 5 p.m. Eastern for the next day's games is usually when those pop, if they don't have a back-to-back. Otherwise, you have to wait till the game's over. Props we usually don't start seeing until sometimes the morning, but oftentimes late at night we'll get some prop action, or like the first kind of smattering of props overnight. When you on any given night during the NBA season, what's your process when you open the app, when you open the odds board? You can catch that Action Network as well. What's your process? What's the first thing that you kind of look at when you're trying to figure out the next day's bets, Joe?
I mean, I'm always looking to see like which games like stand out to me from like number one, like a watchability perspective, right? Like I'm like, which game do I want to watch? Like which game am I interested in? And because I think that matters just in terms of like who you're paying attention to on a nightly basis. So that's always one thing that I look at. And then you have to look at sides, you have to look at totals because it does influence, especially in the way that the NBA has been, where you have these games with some blowout potential. You have these games where maybe you have two like lightning paced teams and you have another game that has like the Magic and the Heat and they might score 200 points. So there's always some things that you have to kind of pay attention to from a sides and totals perspective that then does influence like what player props are available and then what is even actionable from that perspective.
I think when you kind of look at the board, like this is one of the things you have to develop, and like I'm honestly still like developing it to be like to look at a line or a spread or a total or a prop, and just like instinctively be like, well, that seems off, like that just doesn't seem right, and to be able to make that read. Like sometimes I'll do it, I will be like, oh, that doesn't seem right, and then like any sort of assessment further from that, and I'm like, oh no, it seems right. That wah wah. Watts, when you kind of look at the board, how do you determine what's like the first thing that you're looking at when you're trying to get a sense of what the board looks like?
Generally speaking, I'm doing what you're talking about, where if I just look and try to see what looks off to me. Then I do a little more digging on that game. If everything kind of checks out, then I move on to the next line that maybe seems off. One thing that I like about using a projection system or model or whatever you want to call it is you really have a baseline for what you're looking for. Like I can say, oh, that line seems way too long, and then it's like, oh, like you said, you're like, yeah, actually, no, that makes sense. But the reason I choose those lines that seem off is because I'm plugging in information into my model. So it might be that I'm missing something, like, oh, there's an injury in this game, or maybe there's a rest spot that I hadn't really factored in initially. Maybe this person is going to be on a minutes limit, whatever it may be. So I think starting with those lines that seem off is a great way to start. And I mean, it doesn't really matter where I start per se, because I'm looking at every game anyways, but that's where I start.
So I think when you bet is always like an interesting question, right? Because if you pounce on these lines when they first come out, and buckets, we record most weeknights. We're gonna have the podcast recorded around 11 when we do buckets live. It'll be at 11 Eastern. We'll have more details on that for you in the coming weeks. Otherwise, like it'll go up like overnight. It'll be up like late that night for the morning. It should be up when you first get up. And the lines may have already moved. And like this is always like an interesting question I have is like I have in the rundown, like, do you want to be ahead of line movement? And the answer is like obviously yes. Like you never want to be behind line movement. You don't want to be chasing steam, and learning to predict those things. Like that's one of the things, man, do I struggle with that so much about like my assumption of where a line is going to move to based off of it. And I'm not always wrong, but it's enough that I'm like, okay, this is really difficult. The other thing is that you can be ahead of the line, and in all betting, and like this is a core tenet of like a lot of what Action does, and that's why we have the app, right? Is for you to be able to get these bets in and figure out and kind of be ahead of the market to predict where the line's going to move, et cetera, track where the money's coming in. Sharp moves, if you got the pro subscription, it'll give you in the pro section, it'll give you like, hey, sharps have hit this, like we're tracking sharp movement on this line or total. And that's really valuable, except for the fact of in the NBA, it's like, hey, I got like this really awesome number because I got it at 4.5, and it's 7.5, and then that he's just not playing tonight. He's just not the best player. Just not going to play. It just doesn't feel like it. So that's not going to happen. And then your bet's worthless by tip off. But Joe, I kind of want to ask you about this, about like trying to get ahead of line movement. I know the prop market is a lot easier for this, where there are things that just like get steamed into oblivion because they're so off versus spreads and totals, which are obviously a little bit more efficient.
Yeah, I mean, it's easier for me to address the prop market because that's generally like what I'm doing the majority of my betting with. But it is like a little bit of a game of cat and mouse in a way with the books, because you do get limited. Like you're going to get limited if you like just keep hammering opening lines a lot of the times too. So there is a question to a degree, right? It's like, how much is it worth taking advantage of this line right now at like maybe a lower limit, or is it better like for my liquidity, for like my bankroll, for my account health, to maybe wait a little bit and see how the line settles, because I think that I'm going to have an edge no matter what. So that's kind of one of the things that I've been trying to weigh. I do think that there's value in giving out lines sometimes like right at the open, because it's just way wrong. And there's some opportunities there where you're like, I got to take advantage of this. I think that this is just too off of the way I'm projecting it. There's too much value to be laid on the table. But it is a little bit of a balancing act between saying like, am I going to do this every time, or am I going to do this some of the time where I think it's most advantageous? So like me jumping on a line where I'm like, oh, this is say like 28.5 at minus 105. It might, but I'm betting it at like 7 o'clock the night before. It doesn't necessarily have the same value to not only me, but to the listeners, to the followers. If I wait until the next day and say, hey, it's 28.5, but it's just minus 115 now, but you're going to have a lot more liquidity. You're going to have a lot more opportunity to hit this line. There's a little bit of a balancing act there. So that's part of what I'm thinking about with some of the player prop markets. And it's a bit of a game of like, when am I going to get the most value for not only me, but then also for the people that are like subscribing and supporting my work.
Joe, can I ask you something? In props, are the numbers as essential? Because I do think why, and we'll talk about this in a section about how there are no key numbers in basketball. There are some interesting trends I can kind of point to, but like it's not as like if you get if you're betting the over on points and it's 22.5 versus 24.5, that to me feels like it's less of a absolutely devastating line move for you to bet into rather than Celtics minus 5.5 versus Celtics minus 7.5. Is that track?
100%. It's funny you say that because I just talked about this on Cash That to a degree right before we got on here. And what I was talking about was like when you look at these players and when you look at projected outcomes, because one of the things that I've been doing more really with WNBA and like towards the back end of NBA season last year was incorporating a little bit more modeling, a little bit more projecting into my player prop like picks, right? And when we look at players, we're betting on it's I think it's really helpful to use projections as like a baseline, as a median, as something that kind of anchors what our analysis is, because it's running through a simulation like hundreds, thousands of times to get to a raw projection number. But within that, it's a little bit different because certain players have different outcomes. And if you looked at a player like a Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, for example, Shai's distribution in terms of what his points is like very narrow between say like the 40th and 60th percentile, because he's always at like 30 to 33, just like always there. But then you get a guy like maybe like a Benedict Mathurin or a Malik Monk, and they're going to have a game that's at 5, and they're going to have another game that's at 25. And then there's a lot more room in between. So for a guy like Shai, where the scatter plot's a little bit tighter, it might matter a little bit more. But for a guy that you're basically saying like, I'm kind of betting on like 70th percentile and 30th percentile outcomes, then a 1 point or 2 point swing isn't necessarily as damning towards your cap and towards your bet.
Watts, for me, I think especially when I'm betting totals, I'm spread. I am often my projection system will very rarely be like, no, this is no longer a bet, and if it is, like I wasn't that interested in it to begin with. Like if my margin's that narrow on it, but with totals, it does get like that to me gets a lot dicier. Where it's like if you are like, especially if there's just a lot of times I'm like, yeah, I think tomorrow I'm going to bet the over on this game. It seems like a really good play. Okay, it's 228. All right, I'll hit that in the morning. And then I wake up on mountain time and it's like, oh, it's 231.5 now. So goodbye to the 220s. And, and then it becomes, and this happens with everything, right? Where it becomes, but NBA is so much more volatile where it's like, you're worried. It's like, how far is this going to get out to? Like, should I get in on it? Is it still good at 231.5? Or am I going to feel dumb if I don't hit it now and then it winds up at 234.5? Like, what am I supposed to do here? Because it does seem like totals move a lot more, obviously, than spreads, which makes a lot of sense. What's kind of your approach with trying to manage line movement overnight and then throughout the day as far as when to be? What's a buy point entry for you?
Yeah, for me, I value the knowledge of who's playing so much when it comes to sides, at least, that I've actually started waiting a lot later to get in on those sides. Like, do I want CLV? Of course. But if there's a question about a player being in or out, I'll wait until that lineup drops and there's no doubt in my mind that this person is playing or not, because the way that I track my model is against the closing line. And I can say that even if I'm losing CLV here, this hits at 60%, or in this range, it hits at 57%, whatever it is. So I would rather get that information and worry a little bit less about CLV. Now, if I think that there's absolutely no chance that there's any person like, sitting or being in or whatever, if there's no right. Injury question,
like an imaginary, completely different world.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Then I might go a little earlier if I'm feeling cocky about what I know. But I just think that in this load management era, it's so tough to predict that stuff. So I've actually started betting games like once the lineups drop, and that's pretty close to tip off. I know that pretty much goes against every sports betting book you could read from 25 years ago or whatever. Like The Logic of Sports Betting was one of the first books I read on the subject, and they talk about hammering those opening lines. I mean, I think that's still very important and valuable if you feel like your edge is hitting those opening lines. For me, my edge is against the closing line.
Yeah.
So I really actually realizing that my process is way different from most people's is actually what unlocked my betting, since using this model. So
And you can turn on
yeah.
notifications. You can turn on notifications for Watts too in the app, so that if you want to be able to get in, because he's basically giving you like a 30-second window here for you to be able to get your bets in. And I think that like one of the things I think I'm going to do a lot more this season is try and buy out of positions when these things radically change. But one of the other issues that I do run into, and like this is a separate kind of conversation, but like, look, I'm trying to think of what a good team to do this with is. The Clippers will be a good one with this. Let's say that Kawhi comes back and he's plays for a couple of weeks, right? And then all of a sudden, and like I bet the Clippers at plus 4.5, and then Kawhi's out, so this line moves to 7.5, 8.5, whatever that is, right? I'm gonna like the Clippers more at that spot. And at that point, like you honestly kind of need to treat it as like an entirely separate number. And there's a lot of tools that you can use to kind of examine if a player's in or out, and we'll provide those for you. But like that's something that I do tend to track is some teams are actually pretty okay without their major guys in the lineup. Other teams are like, if this player is not in, they are going to lose, and they are going to lose very badly. And you kind of got to get a sense for those. And if you got questions on that, you can hit me on Twitter at HB Basketball, and I'm happy to kind of give you some tools for how to find out that information, because I can't just be like, this guy, not that guy, this guy, not that guy. It's really not doable.
Yeah.
It really, and it's honestly, it's year by year too, because the Sixers, for example, are going to be entirely different without Embiid this season than they have been the previous seasons. And quite honestly, last year, they were not, even though they lost a lot without Embiid, ATS, they were not that bad last season compared to previous seasons when it was like, oh God. And so like, it's just very variable. And so you have to kind of weigh all these kind of factors, which is a good reason, honestly, that, in these kind of situations is to kind of just stay away from it. And there are some teams like the Sixers that you should, the only team in the NBA I'll be like, you should never, ever, 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 ever bet on is just the Sixers. Like, you shouldn't do it.
Just never assume Embiid's healthy.
No.
Well, if you know Embiid's out, if you know Embiid's going to be out, then you can bet them.
Yeah.
Because they like, just don't bet into a market where it's like, don't ever bet on the Sixers assuming that Embiid's going to be healthy. Yes. You should only bet against the Sixers if you think Embiid's going to, assuming Embiid's going to be healthy. Let's look at some favorite metrics to kind of look at, and this is going to be different for spreads and totals. I do want to ask you, let's start with spreads and totals, and we'll move to props here in a little bit. This is a really good question, I think, Watts, I want to ask you. Are you looking for, when you're doing the cap, are you looking for basketball reasons to support a market look or a trend? Or do you want to use the market and like, okay, this has moved in this direction, and various trends to support when you're like, I think this is a really good basketball matchup for them? I know the model changes this, but what's your kind of thought on that?
Because I use my model pretty strictly. That was another thing that kind of like unlocked my handicapping, was like, no, like this model really works, like trust it. So in trusting the model, I do kind of approach it from the market number standpoint, rather than a basketball standpoint. It's not that I don't care about that. I absolutely care about that, but usually that's where my handicapping starts, is looking at the number. Is this, like I said before, why is this off? Is it off because I'm missing something, or is it off because it's off and I have an edge here? So I can usually, like when I do the deep dive, that's usually when I'm almost like, it's like a detective figuring out why the number is this way, and figuring out what is the basketball reason that is giving me this projection. So I definitely tend to start with the number and then go towards the basketball reason from there. Now, a lot of the times my model is picking up on certain basketball things, like rest spots, for instance. So, someone like Jay Money does a lot of like rest spot betting. So what I've tried to do is incorporate that into my model, give that an actual ATS value that I'm incorporating, so that I can still bet a team if they're in a bad rest spot, because I can say like, no, I accounted for this. That I think is really important, because as much as this might be a spot for a team from a schedule perspective, if they're just leagues better than the team they're playing, it kind of, sometimes it just doesn't matter.
Couple things on the rest spot stuff. One, you can look up various trends on which teams are in various rest spots using Bet Labs, Action Network with a pro subscription. I will also give you a trick of the trade. If you go to bigdataball.com, which is not a site that we are affiliated with or run or have anything to do with, this is a random site that I found. If you go to bigdataball.com and you purchase their NBA schedule, it's a spreadsheet. It has every single rest spot in the calendar. It has all of them. So you can look at third and four back to back, which is different. Back to back, 3 days rest, 2 days rest, all of it. And you can see it for every single game in the matchup. So if you don't want to lose that, because like you need, if you're listening, like whatever you want to use is fine. Make sure that you know what you're getting into. Anecdotally, I adjust 2.5 points for a bad rest spot. I haven't found a need to adjust further off of third and four back to back, but I might do that this season. But an educated, researched approach to this has yielded 2.5 points anecdotally as a good adjustment to the spread based off of if this is a back to back for one team and the other team is rested, then I'm doing that.
So I started doing that actually last season, doing the like extra rest spots, and I found a lot of success with that. And what that gives you, what I've noticed too, is like what that gives you is a pretty ridiculous number. Like, it'll be like, the spread itself will be -3.5, but I'll be projecting -10. Now, that doesn't mean I think the spread should be that. I'm not like, oh, the books should have this -10. But what that's telling me is that there's a massive, or that there's an edge there that I can take advantage of. So, go ahead.
Real quickly on this, I did want to ask you, when you're getting closer to tip off and let's say the lineups are mostly the same, but the steam has moved heavily against your models directionally, how do you respond to that?
I generally have to like the basketball perspective. I have to be eyeing a side. Like generally, if the market's moving against me, like I said, I'm waiting it out anyways.
Right.
But if I'm, I'm using the model heavily, that doesn't mean I bet every single play that my model shows value on. So I think there are certain games that I have my eye on, but I'm like, I don't love it at this number. If it gets there, great. But if not, I'm leaving it out. But there have been many times where it'll just, it'll move to that like 10.5 at tip. And I'm just like, all right, this is ridiculous. Like, yeah, the Hornets, I don't think they're going to win, but like 10.5, they could, lose by double.
The number's wrong. I get it.
Yeah, exactly. So, there has to be some sort of basketball reason behind it. It's not just like, pure numbers play. It could be like 70-30 numbers play, but like there has to be some sort of basketball reason for me to actually pull the trigger.
The bet can be bad because the reasons that you felt the number was wrong were faulty or didn't account for enough, or you had like your handicap was bad.
Yep.
But like it's never a bad bet if you're like, I think this number is wrong. Like that's a great reason to bet it. You can bet into markets where you're like, I think the number's right. I just like the edge on this team. Like that happens all the time. Anyone that says differently is lying. Like there's lots of times when it's like this line's probably right. And especially like you see that in the NFL where everybody's like the market's so efficient. Okay, then why are you betting into it? And it's like, well, I think, I still think that there's value on the side, and that's fine. Yeah. I'm not criticizing that. I just think it's like an interesting kind of counterpoint here. Joe, I want to get your thoughts on this, and you can cover from a spread or prop perspective, talking about like the basketball reasons to look at the market or the trend. Like I knowing you, I don't think that like if a prop number gets steamed, I don't think that you're like, ooh. In fact, I think you're probably like, I probably missed the chance on this one. But trends are also obviously like a big part of your toolkit too. So I'm just kind of curious, how much are you looking at basketball side matchups versus projection systems, whether it's props.cash or the Action Network or whoever, or your own systems, versus starting with more of the trends and markets and then, then looking at the basketball perspective?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a little bit of both, right? And I think when we look at the NBA season as a whole, like they're playing games, right? Like there's certain things X's and O's wise that make a difference, and those things can contribute to particular outcomes or particular bets or particular things that we want to take advantage of. So I know like one thing that we always talk about is like in the regular season, these teams usually aren't like breaking out their full bag of tricks, and if a team plays drop, they're going to probably continue to play drop. Like we'll look at it and go, they're not going to play drop. Like there's no way they're going to play drop against this team. Why
Right.
would they do that? And then the Hawks beat the Bucks in like April. So like just because that's what they do, because it just doesn't matter because it's regular season. But that's something that matters, right? So I do think you have to incorporate the X's and O's to a degree, because there are certain things that modeling or projections or whatever, they can help you like ground for that, like I said, for that median outcome. But if you don't apply like your basketball knowledge, then it makes it a lot more difficult. It's like, I love basketball, I love watching basketball, I'm not the best at playing it, I'm a good hustle guy, but look, like I really care about the game, and it's something that I pay attention to, right? With like soccer, for example, like I appreciate it, but I don't watch it, I don't really understand it. I couldn't just go look at a model and be like, yeah, I'm gonna use that and then apply it here. So I think that you have to, it's all about the balance of understanding the X's and O's, but then obviously tempering it with some of your statistical analysis in the back end. And that's what really makes what we do important and what we do different, because it's not just like shooty hoops, it's just like there's more to it than that, and there's a lot more nuance involved in your individual handicaps.
Yeah, so, and I think this is kind of an important thing to note. If you're a new listener and you're going through and you're trying to handicap a game, you're deciding who you want to bet on. If you're like, oh, they could do this, like they won't have to, like they could just do this thing and mess with them. If it's like, oh, they could just put this guy in the post. Did they ever put that guy in the post this season? Is that something that they do? Because if they don't do it this season, they're not going to suddenly do it in this game. Justin Holiday told me this last season that the NBA regular season is about working on your base concepts. It's about sharpening up what you do to as much as possible. And then the playoffs are about adjusting those as much as possible to whoever you're facing. And it depends on the team, because some teams are like, they want to be like, we want to have multiple looks in the bag.
Yeah.
Right. We want to be able to play drop. We want to be able to switch. We want to be able to play zone. We want to be able to do these things. We want to play pick and roll heavy offense. No, we want to play a motion offense. No, we want to play more pin downs. All of those things are like things that coaches want to work on. But also, I will tell you, there's always like the first thing that they want to work on. And until they get good at that, they usually don't get to the other things, because they're still like, okay, guys, but we're still not good at running pick and roll, which is a problem. And so they just keep coming back to the same thing. The reason I bring this up is, don't get caught in a situation where you're like, if they were to do this, it would be a good. That's a playoff handicap. Okay, that's a playoff handicap, and it's a good one. The regular season handicap needs to be, what do they do? If you're like, I watched this team 3 times in the last couple weeks on League Pass, and I noticed that every single time they get burned by these guards coming off screens and shooting mid-range jumpers. They're not suddenly going to be like, let's change what we do so we don't get hit by mid-range jumpers. They're going to still allow those shots.
Yeah.
I want to talk about spreads. So, Watts, I think this is a really interesting one, and you do a lot of this, and I'm really curious about this, about how do you decide between a first half or a second half spread play?
It's tough. I think it kind of depends on the situation, of course. But for me, I generally am going to tend more towards a full game play, simply because my model has more of an edge in full games. At least for NBA. For WNBA, it's the exact opposite. My first half edge is way stronger in the WNBA. So, for instance, this season, though, I am actually going to be sharpening my projections for first halves, because there are several instances throughout the season where I'm like, I really like this spot for this team. Like, my model's showing value on the full game, so I'm going to bet it. I kind of like the first half better, but I have a more, a better percentage in the full game. And then sure enough, it's like the first half they crush, and then they don't cover the full game, right? So it always feels terrible when you kind of dance around the win, but you were on the right track where you nailed the cap but just messed up the area. So really what it is, I think first half trends, I weight trends a little bit more for first halves because I think it's kind of an energy spot more so than a full game. Like a full game, you kind of have more time for the variance to even out. So I don't really weight these certain types of trends, I should say. So for a first half, I'm going to be more interested in like team personality, so to speak, trends, which can definitely be noisy, but like how does this team do when they lost the last head-to-head matchup? How does this team do off a loss against the spread in the first half? How does this team do when if their coach used to coach the other team or something like this? Some of these like kind of more personality based, which like I said can be kind of noisy. I think those are a little bit less noisy in the first half when there's that where kind of anything can happen a little bit more so than in the full game, like I said, where variance kind of tends to even out.
Joe, do you have thoughts on first half versus full game?
I think it matters, especially with some of these teams that are like gonna blow teams out. Because there are some teams like Boston, for example, like they're gonna like blow the doors off some teams like early. Sure. Like they're playing Washington in the second game for their second game of the season, and like that spread's -13. I'm probably gonna bet it. I think the first half, like you're basically betting on Boston to win by like 2 possessions in the first half. Like that is, sign me up like right now, because the starters are going to play their normal rotation. You get rid of a little bit of that wonkiness. I think that's always like an angle, because the first half rotations, even in like real blowouts, they still kind of run the normal first half rotation. And I think that's important.
Great point.
Yeah, last season the Boston Celtics in the first half were 56, 25, and 1.
There you go.
For a 27.5% ROI.
Yeah, they're good.
That's pretty good.
They're good.
Yeah. Celtics,
I will say,
Pels,
this is a general betting thing. There's nothing more infuriating than when you learn about a trend and then you tail it in what you think is a good spot, and it always wins and then it loses for you. Like the Pelicans did this to me last year on like national broadcast on League Pass of when we did NBA Bet Stream, where I had the Pelicans like 2 weeks out of 4. And I was like, all right, we're going back. We're going with the Pelicans first half. They always nope, they lost by 10. Just, God damn it,
they were so good in the first half too.
I know, it's so annoying. So I do think this is kind of interesting from the perspective of bettors over the long haul of the NBA, betting NBA history. Will tell you like it's not like NFL because there are no key numbers, because every touchdown is 6 points, and so field goal 3, and so it's very set, right? So there have to be these numbers that occur more often, and I'm never going to say like there are key numbers in the NBA, because there are not. What I do think is kind of interesting though is if you look at last season in particular, the most games had the spread, the most frequent spread was -2.5, +2.5. 91 games had that sample. The next one was -4.5, which was 81, so 10 fewer. And then you have this little clump of like 4.5, 3.5, and then there's a huge drop off of 14 or 13 games differential down to -1.5. And on the other end of it, 6.5, which makes sense, right? Like there's that like 2.5 is at the top of the bell curve, and then you have like on the decline, like these other ones that kind of come out there, and that's how it goes from the tail.
And that's for closing line.
Yeah, that's closing line. And so I just think it's kind of interesting that so often -2.5 is like where these games end, which isn't. I will say it kind of depends on where you put home court advantage. Last season I have it as slightly below this, but like the season before it wound up about 2.5. Like that's not like a bad number to use for a home court adjustment on average. It's very dependent, and home court advantage is weaker in professional sports than it ever has been, which I continue to be very fascinated by. Currently in the NFL, it's 0.8. That's via nfelo.com. It just doesn't matter. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say something that I did last season was have different home court advantages for different teams. Denver and Utah home court advantage is going to be different than, Atlanta's home court advantage. I mean, Atlanta didn't have any advantage last year, so that's probably a bad example. But, I think that, I'm curious. You said the average in NFL is 0.8, right? So what's so I'm curious, like, what's the, does that vary by team? Because for me, in my experience with betting NBA, it absolutely varies by team. Like there are home teams and there are doesn't matter if you're at home teams. And because ostensibly you should be, 50-50, right? Against the spread, home and away. You should be in a perfect world, right? But that's just not the case. And I have been basing my unique home court projections based on previous ATS experience or ATS success over the course of several years. Yeah.
It's actually, I want to correct this via Neflo, and it's now 0.2. It's the home field advantage in the
It's
NFL
like nothing. You're almost at a disadvantage.
Yeah. I mean, the Niners are marked at minus 5.9 on there, and there are teams where, so like my biggest advantage last season was the Jazz, and then the Magic were actually I think second best in that area. Denver actually wasn't as good. Denver gets a lot of the bump because of the altitude perception, but I think it's starting to be mitigated a little bit where teams are kind of changing the idea of it. But I do think that you just need to be, I think it's always better to do that. I think for a casual bettor, I think it's hard. You need to have like a general idea in your head of how much you want to account for home fields or home court. So like one of the things that you can do if you're not building a model or building a spreadsheet, in which case you know more than I do, and you should just do that. But the other thing you can kind of do is just like think about take last season I had it at the average at 2.1. Do you have an average for yours? Watts?
I do, but I actually haven't. I can actually calculate it real quick, but I don't have it on hand because it's different for everyone.
Run that for me right now is for an average. So what I would say is you could start with a 2.1 as like a 2 points. Take 2 points home court advantage, and then just adjust it based off of how you think that they play at home. If you think you're like, I want to give Denver an extra point because they're really dominant, because they have altitude advantage and they always win these games at home. If you want to say and you'll learn oh, maybe I shouldn't do that. They got their asses kicked. That's part of it though. To be able to give you kind of an advantage, that's the Jazz last year were unbelievable in their home versus away splits. It was wild. And we missed the boat, honestly, and not pointing it out more of hey, you should just bet the Jazz anytime that they're at home because they are insane. But yeah, so I just think it's interesting. You can get really caught by the variances of some teams are actually going to wind up negative, because you will have years where the Warriors actually last year I had as a negative home court, and that's after the year before where they had a negative home court. So it gets a little, or where they were so bad on the road. I'm sorry, last year they were a little bit at home. So it will kind of change and shift, but I think it's also okay to kind of give teams a standard if you're just kind of doing an eyeball handicap and not building a projection system.
Yeah. So I did 2.5 is kind of the baseline, but when I run my actual numbers, it's 1.28. Yeah. That's the average.
Yeah.
Because I'll go, and this is another thing, I'll go negative on a team. I try not to go too negative, but if you're being overvalued at home, I'm gonna give you less to the spread in my projections because you're being priced improperly. Now you're kind of you could argue that the issue with that is you're kind of playing catch up to the market in a way because you're basing it on historical, market trends. But honestly, that's why I like to use a baseline of multiple years and not just the most recent year. Now that does change year to year, but I will base it a little bit heavier on the current year if we're further into the season, if we have a larger sample size. But I just think that having a more dynamic home court advantage is a way where that edge can be amplified. Because another thing that I do is I track how my model does against certain teams. So if I'm overvaluing a certain team, betting on the Magic because I'm overvaluing them at home, then I can tweak that home court advantage to try to get the Magic to a more, reasonable spot.
Joe, do you have thoughts on home court and how to kind of evaluate it?
I think some players play better. Like usually the role, like a lot of times the role players tend to play better at home. Like Keegan Murray has insane home road splits, like for example. So I do think that there is value, especially with player props and guys that I want to say like role players in particular. They do tend to have some like stark splits between playing at home or versus on the road. So there's definitely something that you can read into, just probably from like a comfort level, and having the crowd behind you as opposed to like having the crowd like not behind you or booing you or rooting against you.
Yeah. I'm not gonna go into a whole big thing on totals. Oh, I did want to cover one more thing on dogs. This is my money line record is annoyingly bad for this information that I have. Since 2008, dogs that cover have won outright 63.8% of the time. Since 2000, that's actually since 2009. Since 2014, the last 10 years, it's 65% they've won outright. If we go to 5 years ago, it's 67% outright. And if we go just in the last 2 seasons, it's still very high at 66%. So if you're betting a dog,
yeah,
you should probably inherently be betting on the money line in a lot of these cases. On totals, the only thing I really do want to point out in totals is, and this is actually like very pertinent. If you're listening to this and you're like, I know all this, this one is something that you probably want to listen to. After All-Star last season, when the NBA changed its officiating, which they said that they didn't, which was a lie, totals wound up dropping. If you look at pre-All-Star average total to post-All-Star total, it's 9 points lower. So there was a massive change there. And the question is, all right, what's going to happen this season? Rick Carlisle had comments at Media Day talking about what had happened. I asked Michael Malone about this as well, and I asked her a little bit around the league. When the NBA has a coaches meeting every year, the NBA, all the coaches come in, and the league talks to them about X, Y, and Z to watch out for. And there were comments from several people on the competition committee, including, and like one person that like talked a lot was actually Steve Kerr. And he talked about how everyone really enjoyed FIBA basketball, which is more physical. And the comments were reflective of an expectation that basketball this season in the NBA will be more similar to that, which means a lot closer to what we saw post All-Star. Which, as I have the Celtics Knicks line, like 13 points over the current total gives me a little bit of pause. It's a little scary. So there's some of these things to kind of look at and keep in mind. But just in general, I would just tell you that you should lean very heavily, not towards unders, but towards expecting a lower style of play. So if you're looking at these numbers and you're like, this is crazy, like these two teams are going to score, look at the results after All-Star and what those games looked like. And this is team by team centric too, this is one of the tricky parts. Dallas was really good in this environment.
Yeah.
Where they were just able, like their fans would talk about this, about how like they just would foul and get away with it. And they were a lot better at defense when they could just foul and get away with it rather than trying to play straight up. So like that's something to really kind of keep in mind. Watts, do you have anything on totals that you just kind of want to mention here before we move on to player props?
Yeah, I mean, I do a lot better with sides, so I definitely tend towards those. But I think that FIBA style is a lot. I think it makes for more interesting basketball. So I'm excited from a fan perspective, but I also noticed that, my projections did a lot better post All-Star break. So as a bettor, I'm also very excited to hear that. I think, but it's really interesting to bring that up because that is something that you need to factor into your projections, everybody. Now, maybe it's already factored in, but, these are the kind of things that you got to pay attention to on a big picture scale and figure out how to implement it on a day-to-day basis. So definitely important to note about that officiating change.
All right, Joe. So for like the third year in a row, I'm going to ask you to try and teach me to bet props because I suck at it so hard. I have tried doing my own stuff. I have tried using neutral third party projections. I have tried just like I feel bad now because then I trail you and Jim, and it's like the kiss of death on props. It's bad and very frustrating for me. But I will just kind of ask you, what are like give me like three things that you think are most important for someone who wants to bet props in the NBA this season.
You can't bet them all. Like you can't, right? So, and then I think that one of the other things that you can do is understand that certain player props have more variance. Like if you're betting on somebody to record 2 assists or like 2 threes or something like that, like it is a little bit more difficult to project. It's harder to handicap because the outcomes are they're just fewer outcomes. Whereas like if you're betting on somebody to get 12 rebounds or 25 points, there's more like just more opportunities kind of there, that there's more ways to get there, right? So I think that's important. And then the other thing is like, don't be afraid to bet an under. It is uncomfortable, it's gross, a lot of times it's sweaty, but unders have more outs just inherently. You can win an under on a blowout, you can win an under on an injury, like you don't want to see anybody get hurt, but you can. And you can just win an under because somebody has like a really funky game where they just can't buy a bucket or they get in foul trouble, whatever. So those are a couple of things that I'm guilty of because I like to bet overs. I think overs are more fun, but at the same time, like unders are really valuable. And it's a tool that we have like in our closet, like, in our shed to try to make a profit. So those are a couple of things that I would take from that perspective. But then also from just looking at the market, looking at the players, you don't have like, when I say you don't have to bet on every prop, it's really just like, it's hard to pay attention to every team. It's hard to pay attention to like every player. So there are going to be some things that might pop out in a projection to you, but you're like, I don't know, like that doesn't really make any sense for like X, Y, and Z reason. It's okay to sit it out. There are so many more player props available to you on one night in the NBA than the entire week on spreads and totals. So you have to think about it that way. Like, you have so many more opportunities to find an edge. You don't need to be guessing on like these like narrow edges where you're like, I have this at like a 2% edge. Like you just don't have to. Like if that was a spread or a total, that might be like, I don't really know, but that might be a great edge. Like if you had a 3% edge on a total, you might be like, this is great. Like this is a lot of value right here. But for a player prop, when you could have ones that are like 10% or 11% value, that's what you're looking for. You're not looking for the ones that are super narrow. You can sit those out and you can say like, that's not where I want to spend my money. There's a better opportunity for me here because this particular line or this particular player in this particular matchup is going to give me the like an optimal opportunity to profit.
Unfortunately for you, sides and totals are way more popular.
Yeah.
So you can just But look, if you are 48 minutes into a NBA betting podcast, you are probably the type of sicko that if you're not betting props, should be getting into it. And Joe makes, I thought, a really good case there.
Joe, thank you for describing why I'm bad at props, by the way. That's exactly why. There's so many to bet, and I'm just like, well, what do I have? This guy, this, that. Sides, it's like, okay, there's only so many games. I can't just like bet every game. So this is my favorite. Boom, done. Let's get out of here.
You know what's funny? Because Joe mentioned the unders thing. This is the problem, is that I find specific tactical reasons to bet unders, and I will be 100% right.
Yep.
Defensive coverage, like this is the defender, this is the guy. Like they played the exact scheme. Oh, it's perfect. He didn't score. He scored only. His line was 18.5. He only scored 7 points in the half court. Oh, but he had 3 leak out threes, and then he had 2 technical free throws, and that was it.
Yep. It can happen. It can happen. So, it definitely is tough, but it's like I said, there's so many. There's just so many. Yeah. So you can be a lot more selective, which is a real advantage. And the biggest trap is honestly like, because everybody likes to go parlay, but like when you start adding like a bunch of overs to a parlay, there's only so many, like there's just only so many points that can be scored. Like if you're betting on Ant to score 40 and AD to score 40 and Gobert
I don't
and
know.
AD to each
If we just parlayed all the Pacers early on in the season, we probably would have been pretty good.
maybe
If
that,
we
but
just taken all the overs.
but you know, it gets tough because like that, because that's what our nature is. It's like, oh, I could see that, and then you build this script, and it's like when you actually get down to it, there's only so many points that can be scored. And then even though like you're saying like this is going to be a high scoring game, like that might be the way you're projecting it, the props like work against each other, because if you have two guys in the same team both scoring 30 points and the team's you're only projecting like 110 points for the team, it gets real narrow then on how they get there while finding any success.
I think most of the edges that Watts kind of talks about is based off of the model, which I agree. Like, look, one of the reasons I built the projection system, and there's a lot of ways for you to do this, honestly, a lot of tools for you to do this on your own. But one of the reasons that I started doing it's helped me a lot is just like the NBA, the numbers are so big, and there's 100 possessions on average in the NBA, and you just need to have a number of what you're expecting.
Yeah,
like you just need to have a number. Like it could be a low scoring game in the NFL, and that means like 13-3. And it's just not going to be like 68-60 in the NBA.
no.
And so it's too variant. And so you need to have some sort of number for what to expect. I want to close with this question, and then I do want to ask Watts about a best bet. This is something I have a really hard time with, and that's one of the reasons I'm actually changing my approach this season, where I'm playing. So like Watts talked about, like I don't play everything that my model recommends. I'm doing the opposite, which is like I looked at my performance numbers for the projection system last season, and it was like, you're great, like you're awesome, like this is like you must have had a fantastic year. And then you look at my bankroll, and it is not. And the reason is because I would pick the wrong games. And there's something in the selection bias that I need to fix. And like a lot of that's just like I need to be a better. But I think also just from the standpoint of I notice this a lot when it's like, and I see this honestly with a lot of our cappers at Action and other sports too, of if you're like, I love this spot, I love this game, this is like my favorite play. Like that to me feels like more likely to be the one that loses rather than the other four where you're like, yeah, I lean this way, I'm going to bet it, but like, I don't love it. And it's like those four hit and the one you love, like, no. And there's a lot of reasons and psychology that kind of go into that. But I do want to ask you two in particular. I think this is interesting because of your approaches. And Joe, I want to ask you first. Will you play? Do you want to? There's a lot of people that say that if you're betting long term, you should just keep your units the same every single time. And I try and adhere to that. Are you somebody that will up your units based off of how much you like a play? I know you play the escalators, but will you change how much you're betting based off of how much you like the play, or are you always playing within a structure?
I won't change it often. But I think that the way that I will a lot of times is like you just mentioned, like if I want to play some alts on a play, that is almost my way of increasing my risk. And the reason I'm comfortable doing it that way is because it's increased risk, but not for static reward. It's based off of the fact that every time I'm more right, I'm making like exponentially more money because of the way that the odds are structured. So like if I want to bet on my guy Gobert, if I want to bet on Gobert rebounds ladder, right? Like if I think that this is a great opportunity, then I'm going to hit the base. Maybe instead of betting it for like 1 unit flat, I might bet to win 1 unit to increase a little bit on the base. But then after that, I want to be hitting the alts on the ladder in a way where I made my profit on the baseline, but then everything after that is gravy. So like, even if I did lose all the alts, I still returned a profit on being right initially. And I'm okay with like risking a little bit of that being right on the fact that I think I could be really, really right if he gets to like 16 or 18 rebounds, and then I can really turn a big profit on it. So I'm increasing my maximum profitability, but I'm not necessarily increasing my exposure to like in a parabolic fashion, or so to speak.
Okay, congrats on you get the nerd award of the week on a pretty nerdy podcast for the use of parabolic.
This is a pretty nerd one.
Even for me, I'm like, whoa, easy there, Poindexter. Takes a lot to get me in that zone, Delara. Watts, what are your kind of thoughts about adjusting your unit play based off of where you're at on a particular game or spot?
So one thing that I started doing was based on that trend that you mentioned earlier about dogs that cover tend to win. I started betting to win. So I'll bet a unit on a play that I like that meets the threshold for a strong play. If I really like it, and it's a dog, I'll bet to win a half unit on the money line. So as a way to increase that gain without risking too much more. If it's a favorite that I really like, sometimes I'll lay just risk a half unit on the money line for the favorite, so that even if they win but don't cover, I'm not totally screwing myself. But at least I'm getting some of that back. But obviously I'm not risking too much. I'm only like laying a unit and a half. So that is definitely something I'll do, but I rarely will make like a 2-unit play or a 3-unit play or something like that. I will do it sometimes, but it's a lot fewer and far between. I'll do that approach I mentioned first. But again, one thing I wanted to just address what you talked about with the not using the model, not playing everything on the model. To kind of be a little more specific, I am playing almost all of the plays that are in my highest like edge range. That is another thing that that did change about my handicapping when I kind of took it up a notch. Is that I was just like, look, I'm talking myself out of I'm talking myself out of these strong bets, and I have a literal data center that is like telling me, yeah, but this hits at 60%. Like, so, okay, like just because my vibes are off, like, how about you figure out why it's in that range of 60% instead of trying to stay away from something just because your vibe isn't there, right? Like being more, that's kind of where that process comes into play. Is like, no, dig deeper, find more reasons. And if after digging deep and it doesn't matter, like if I'm betting on a team and it's like they're literally 0-10 against the spread in the last 10, it's like, okay, I'll just sit this one out. If it hits, so be it. But other than that, barring like a massive red flag or two, I'm pretty much am playing all of those plays if they're in a good enough range.
Yeah, my unders last season continue to be like great. So I'm at the point now where it's like if I'm showing if I have an edge on a total that's more than 3 points on a total to the under, I'm like,
yeah,
I would do really well on those. And you can check that in the Action Network app. Okay, so I appreciate this conversation. I thought it was really good. And I do want to give Watts a chance because he's not going to be on our Best Bets episode tomorrow night. Now there's Joe. That'll be Sean Little and Jay Money with a new show that I'm calling Cash Only. Is our new nickname for that show is Cash Only. But Watts, you have a play for opening night in the NBA. You actually get the first best bet technically of buckets this season. So
there we go. I love it. Yeah.
Fire away.
Joe, earmuffs, buddy. It's Celtics -5. This is a Celtics team that has continuity. Look, they're missing Porzingis, but everyone else is there. This is the championship team we saw, 6 months ago or whatever it was. The Knicks are completely different. They have a completely different identity, ostensibly. They got rid of 2 of the best offensive rebounders in the game, which is where a lot of their offense came from. And they replaced those 2 people with Mikal Bridges and Karl Anthony Towns. Obviously a talent upgrade overall, but what they also sacrificed was depth. Now, I think there are going to be plenty of spots where I'm betting on the Knicks this season. Opening night, when they've had very little time to mesh, is not going to be one of those spots. They are, this is also a model play where I have this pretty heavily towards the Celtics. And I I don't think that now, if this were the same team from last year, it would be a different story. But we don't have that continuity. We don't have that reliability. And we don't have a lot of the marquee kind of things that made that Knicks team last season so so surprising and so effective. So I think 5 is too short. I don't necessarily think it's a terrible line, but I'm showing enough value on this line. And given what I've seen just from an off-season perspective, I think the Celtics are going to probably come away with this one. I more in the 9-point win range.
Okay. All right. I will have my bets. I'll have a betting card for the opening night on the Action Network, and we'll talk about it more tomorrow night on Buckets with Jay Money and Sean Little. We'll break it down in detail in tomorrow's episode, so you can catch that. So be on the lookout for that. I have a killer trend for this game that is a big reason why I'm on this game. Before we get out of here, Joe Delara's best bet is Knicks money line. Just go ahead.
Carl Anthony Towns over 20.5 points. Book it. The pick and roll is unbelievable with Brunson, and I just think it's a good matchup with Horford. He's 38, and then after that, we're looking at Hauser, Tillman. The one thing that looks good right now, I know there's not a lot of continuity, is that Brunson Cat pick and roll. So 1.3 points per possession during the preseason. So we'll bet on that.
I think I'm going to end every show that I do this season with all right, that's going to do it for Buckets. Oh, by the way, Joe Delara's best bet is Knicks money line, even if they're not playing.
82-0.
82-0. All right, that's going to do it. Last preseason show of Buckets. My thanks to Andrew O'Connor Watts and Joe Delara for joining me. You can catch them on Twitter and the Action Network app. Andrew's at NBA Watts, and Joe Delara is at Joe Delara. Thanks for joining us. Appreciate you guys being with us. My thanks to Tio Benach and the video team. Get this up at youtube.com/the Action Network. My thanks to David Payne for all of his hard work helping us through the off season. He's done a lot of editing on a lot of long episodes, and I really appreciate David's work. We'll see you guys again tomorrow. Till then, let's get buckets.